presentation here. Do let me know if you can't see it. So first of all, thank you very much to the project Wisbech High Street for inviting me to speak, and to the Heritage Lottery Fund for their funding, obviously. I'm very interested to know where you guys are today. Thank you for taking your lunchtime to come and talk to us, and or rather to come and listen to me talk. So please do put in the chat, you know, who you are, where you are, and if you're eating something delicious, put that in there too. So over the next hour, I'm basically going to give you a kind of a whistle-stop introduction to climate change, impacts and implications for built heritage. The talk is divided into two sections, roughly. So first of all, how do we understand climate risk? You know, what are the projections and what might the impacts be for heritage? And then once we understand that, how can we manage that risk? But not just for heritage, but also for wider society. So first of all, we've all heard about climate change, but what's important is to know that climate change is a long-term phenomenon. We can't point to one event and say that's due to climate change. We have to look at a pattern over a long period, what's called the climate norm, which is around 30 years. So it's a change in the long-term pattern of climate or climate variability. So climate change then for the UK, and we've already seen some of these effects, but they're projected to become more extreme, warmer, wetter winters, hotter, drier summers, an increase in the frequency of extreme and unpredictable weather. And of course, very importantly for an island nation is sea level rise. But how that climate change then interacts with heritage assets to create impacts is quite complex, and very often it'll be a number of different climate change impacts reacting together to produce effects on heritage, and very often also it's coming on top of existing stresses within the environment. So it can be quite a complex picture to try to figure out exactly how climate change is going to affect the heritage. In general, we can divide impacts between direct and indirect. So if we look at the direct impacts first, these are the impacts of the climate directly on the heritage itself. And I just further subdivide these into what I think of as the tortoise and the hare. So there's those catastrophic sudden events like a flood or a storm. They cause very visible damage, but they tend to be limited in the extent. And then there's the cumulative or slow onset events. These are events that relate to a change in the weather, the climate, so things like changes in weathering processes. These are slower, they happen over a longer period of time, but they tend to be more widespread. And they're not always very visible. Then there's the indirect effects. Now, the indirect effects relate to the human part of the system. So how people are mitigating greenhouse gases. So, for example, energy retrofit of historic buildings, and how people are adapting to a changed climate. So that could be, for example, the building of coastal or riverine flood defences, which could impact on heritage. So what I'd like to do now is just take a minute, and I'm going to put up a whiteboard in a second, to ask you what you think might be the impacts of most concern for your area. And maybe they're slow onset, maybe they're catastrophic, or maybe they're indirect. Maybe they're impacts that you've already experienced, or maybe they're things that you are worried about in the future. So just bear with me for 1 second while I stop sharing that screen and share a whiteboard. So it's anonymous what you write up here, and you can generally choose a little text button there, and you can write, or you can try freehanding, or you can take a sticky note. Flooding, yes. So flooding is definitely one of the major impacts, and that would be considered catastrophic. There's riverine and coastal flooding, of course, and also pluvial flooding, which can occur more in cities where drainage is a problem. Anybody else thought of any impacts? Retrofit? Yes, yeah, so that would be an indirect effect, definitely. Okay. All right. So maybe you haven't thought that much then about climate change impacts. So let's have a look. I'm going to go back to sharing the PowerPoint. And that's not uncommon. A lot of people haven't really given that much thought to climate change, although I think that is increasing. But for a long time, climate change was seen as something in the far future and a far off risk. And I think a lot of people are dealing with more immediate issues. But actually, climate change is now having quite a severe impact on a lot of sites. So, for example, somebody mentioned flooding. So this is an example of riverine flooding. This is the Iron Bridge Gorge Museum in 2020. Coastal flooding, obviously, Venice is the poster child for this. And coastal flooding can be worse where you get cities or heritage sites which are built on rivers at the coast. So there you can have a combination of heavy rain causing riverine flooding combined with high tides or storm surge causing coastal flooding, and so they can actually compound each other. Coastal erosion is another one. This image was created by the Cherish project, looking at climate change effects on coasts of Ireland and Wales. And you can see here that this isn't and this is actually quite an important point to make as well, that many of these effects are not new. What's new with climate change is the rate and the scale of many of these effects. So coastal erosion is a natural process. It's always been happening. If you look here at the bottom line of images, you can see the green line, which represents where the coast was in an 1898 plan. And then the red line where it was in 2017 when Cherish did their LiDAR survey. And then the blue line where it was in 2018 when they repeated. So less than a year later, quite a lot of loss had occurred. So it's definitely accelerating, but it is a process that occurs naturally anyway. So with this site, this is Doonbeg on the coast of Kerry in Ireland. The decision has been made to record this site and accept its loss. Okay, there's really nothing that can be done to save this site. Storm damage, obviously another issue with climate change, and that the loss is not just the loss of heritage, but also the socioeconomic impacts. So, for example, after Hurricane Sandy, the Statue of Liberty in Ellis Island was closed for a year to tourists. So there was a big loss there, in addition to the cost of recovery, which was estimated at about $77 million. Biological damage would be one of these slow onset cumulative effects that I mentioned. And here it's about, those warmer winters, for example, meaning that we could have an increase in the activity of pests that we already have. But we could also expect that we could get new pests who maybe wouldn't have survived in our climate beforehand. Instability. So things like erosion, subsidence, landslip, due either to very dry summers causing kind of vegetation dieback, or to the very heavy rainfall, which can also occur. And those effects affect landscape, and cultural landscape is definitely going to be one of the I suppose, key victims in a way of climate change, in that, sense of place, which is tied to a lot of the sort of natural species, biological, botanical species, sorry, I should say, which may not be able to survive a drastically changed climate. So these are images from Saguaro National Park in the USA, and you can see how increasingly hot summers are causing the seedlings to die off, and then also there's a sort of an invasion of buffalo grass. I think that should be buffalo grass, and wildfires. So again, a combination of different stressors which are quite drastically changing the values of the place. And of course, wildfire we saw very dramatically in Australia last year, but also around Manchester, there were some wildfires. And again, the hotter, drier summers, this could be an increasing problem. And it's not just tangible heritage, but also intangible heritage, which is affected because, of course, many of our cultural traditions developed with strong ties to place and environment. This is the Cherry Blossom Festival in Japan, which always happens on the 13th to the 17th of April. However, increasingly, the cherry blossoms are actually blooming and have finished blooming by the time the festival starts now because of warmer springs. And so in many places, people are having to use artificial cherry blossom during the festival week. And somebody mentioned retrofit, and this is a serious issue, and it's often termed maladaptation. So this is an example from Preston of cladding being put on a Victorian home without understanding the nature of the historic fabric, how these buildings breathe, and it created a lot of problems inside the building with damp and mold, and actually the building became uninhabitable. And of course, there are also other things like the increase in wind-driven rain, which can cause both abrasion, on the exterior of the building, but also more water penetration and changes in humidity, which will affect salt cycles and other slow onset deterioration mechanisms that rely on humidity. So lots of potential impacts, but then how can we manage this risk once we've identified it? So a lot of people are employing, either risk assessment or something called vulnerability assessment, which looks at exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And unlike exposure and sensitivity, which are quite hard to change because they tend to be around, where is your asset located? What is your asset made of? What is the climate change in that area going to be? But adaptive capacity is something that lies mainly within the human part of the system, and deliberate efforts to increase capacity to cope with or even to avoid in some places the impacts of climate change are possible. And so this is generally where adaptation planning comes in. So in climate change, when we talk about mitigation, we're talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's what mitigation in climate change language refers to. And adaptation is trying to either reduce impacts, increase resilience, or benefit from any opportunities that climate change brings. So the Paris Agreement, UNFCCC Paris Agreement of 2015, Article 7 is all about adaptation. And all the countries that signed up to that agreed a global goal on enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change. And that's, for all sectors of society, basically, including heritage, although heritage wasn't specifically mentioned in the Paris Agreement here. So in 2015, a study was done with World Heritage properties, and the author identified what she called the 6 key determinants for adaptive capacity of cultural heritage. Now, it was looking specifically at World Heritage properties, but you know, the suggestion was that these would apply in broad terms to heritage management. So the factors were resources, financial, obviously, but not just financial, also human and technological, authority. So that relates to actually having plans and policy instruments, and importantly, political will. Access to information. So are you doing monitoring? Do you have the guidance that you need? Learning capacity. That's about institutional memory. So very often, you know, understanding what's happened in the past at a particular site can help guide you for the future. So learning from past incidences and responses. And leadership is so important. Having senior level commitment, having champions and people who create a vision, and some of the heritage agencies in the UK are doing that, like Historic Environment Scotland and Historic England. And cognitive factors, which comes down to individual perception of risk. So how, you know, do you see climate change as a risk? Are you open to trying to address it despite the complexities and uncertainties? So let's try the whiteboard again and see if you guys identify with any of those barriers. So I'm not sure where you are coming from or where you work, but what do you think, or even just within kind of your local area, do you see any of those barriers as being relevant, and which ones do you identify most with? So I'm going to stop sharing that, and I'm going to try sharing the whiteboard. Okay. So have a go. I mean, quite often people will cite lack of engagement and technical knowledge. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I actually, I mean, quite often people will cite money, because money is always a problem with heritage. But I do think some of the others actually may be even more important. Just knowing where to start or having some idea. Now, I did put together a few links to some information which could help here. So Pip is going to put those in the chat. So links just to general documents, nothing too kind of heavy duty, but you know, Historic Environment Scotland and Historic England are doing a lot on this and have published, you know, quite a few documents which are on their websites. Also, ICOMOS, The Future of Our Pasts, which is a big document, but it's an overview of the topic. So it was an attempt by our Climate Heritage Working Group to basically cover all of the intersections between climate change and heritage. So even if you're not particularly interested in risks or impacts, there might be something else in there for you. It also talks about climate justice and mitigation and so on. And by the way, I have to apologize if you hear snoring, it's my dog. Okay. So does anybody have anything they want to add to the whiteboard? You can just squiggle if you want. No? Okay, that's fine. I'll go back to sharing my... Okay, so I just think it's important to think about that if you want to address this issue, or if you're not addressing this issue, to maybe consider why that is and what you need to help you to get there. And like I said, if it is a bit of guidance, a bit of a vision and some information, then please do follow those links that were sent by Pip in the chat. Okay, so the next thing I thought I would just very briefly talk about is a project that I was involved with in 2019, which was writing the climate change adaptation strategy for built and archaeological heritage for the Government of Ireland. And this was, well, basically, countries all over the world are or should be developing adaptation plans, particularly as you could see from the Paris Agreement, they've signed up to do that, and also the European Union are pushing for it, etc. So many countries don't really consider cultural heritage. Many of them don't even mention actually cultural heritage in their adaptation plans. Some of them have mainstreamed cultural heritage within their plans. So, for example, in Scotland, there's no individual plan for heritage, but Historic Environment Scotland were very involved in the adaptation planning process, and so heritage is in there. Some countries have developed standalone plans for heritage, and Ireland is one of those. So there's 11 sectoral plans which are individual plans, but altogether they form the National Adaptation Plan. And one of those sectors was built in archaeological heritage. If you are interested, you can find this plan online. We can also send a link to it later. So the approach in writing this plan was to follow exactly the same process as every other sector. So there were a lot of larger sectors like transport, health, agriculture, forestry, fishery, who were developing plans, and heritage was developed using exactly the same process. And it was very important that we spoke to the other sectors, we knew what was going in their plan, and we identified possible synergies as well as possible conflicts, so that the plans all work together rather than against each other. And it was a 6-step process, quite, a logical process of preparing the ground, so setting up the scope and who's going to do what, etc. Then doing a climate impact screening, which is kind of what we've already done here today. What could the impacts be? Then what are the priority impacts? Because the plan can't address every single impact. So we used stakeholder consultation. We identified the priority impacts for Irish heritage. And then the priority impact assessment is gathering case studies that show how the route that these impacts can take. If we're talking about coastal erosion, for example, we looked at places where it was already happening, responses to it, and how successful those were. And then we developed the adaptation plan itself. So that comes quite late in the process once you've gathered as much information as you can. And the plan has 5 goals and a number of specific actions under each goal. And what's important is the actions are time limited. So it says, the plan is for 5 years. So it says what year each action should be done in, and it says which stakeholders should be involved. So it really is designed to be an actionable plan, not, quite specific, not just something a bit vague and that will never materialize. So at the moment, it's in its implementation phase, and at the end of the 5 years, it'll be reviewed. But in general, if you're thinking about adaptation actions, probably the best thing everyone can do is just maintenance and repair. It's good no matter what happens. So it's a win whatever action, because there is a lot of uncertainty around climate change, and as we saw, a lot of barriers. But maintenance and condition monitoring that help you to understand what's going on in maintenance, which just strengthens the resilience of your heritage asset, are never going to, be wasted. Another issue is managing change. So, modern conservation is already seen as a process of managing change rather than, putting sites in aspic. However, how much change, can we allow? So given the fact that global climate change is likely to lead to really an accelerated and extreme change in some places, we may need to reassess what managing change actually means for heritage. So there's 3 options really. One, you can resist the change. It's likely to be a short-term solution in most cases. The second is that you can enhance the system's capacity to cope with the change, which is what adaptation planning is all about. And the third is that you transform the system to a new state that's actually more compatible with the changed climate. And that's a little bit problematic for heritage, because that starts to go into issues around value, integrity, and authenticity. So adaptation actions are generally classified as grey, which are the hard engineering solutions, like, build a flood wall; green, which are the more ecological nature-based solutions, such as planting grasses on sand dunes to stop erosion; or soft, and soft are around capacity building, training, policy making, etc. But what I wanted to flag here, what you can see in this illustration, is that depending on the level of adaptation intervention, you will be sort of in a kind of a there will be tension with the concept of authenticity. So you can see at the very end of the arrow, very low intervention things like maintenance and repair, which have very little impact on authenticity. But if you go to the other end, where we're talking about relocating heritage assets or managing loss, then obviously you're really having an impact on authenticity and also even integrity when you're talking about those kinds of activities. But preparing for loss, I'm sorry about the dog. I don't know if you can hear her snoring. She's really preparing for loss is potentially one of the biggest decisions, because it's about allowing loss to occur, and it's about deciding what we allow to be lost. So the literature has sort of suggested a triage approach, like is used in sort of emergency medicine. So first of all, you identify the sites which are doomed. And so that would be like Doonbeg that I showed you earlier. And those you record and you accept their loss. And, that can be hard, and particularly for local communities. So it needs to be handled, sensitively. But it's better to make those decisions rather than wasting resources trying to save a site that is doomed. And particularly this will occur around the coast. Then there's the sites which have to be saved at any cost. And there won't be many of these, but these will be the ones that you might consider actually moving. And then there's hopefully most sites will be saved by forward planning and an interdisciplinary approach. And the interdisciplinary approach is very important, because we really need to get outside our silos. Climate change is something that affects the whole of society, and the only way you can address it is by taking a whole of society approach. So, the coast, for example, there'll be plenty of people who are interested in coastal erosion, not just heritage people. So we do need to talk to other sectors. And adapting the profession is going to be another challenge. So, I'm an archaeologist. One of the key kind of tenets that we were taught was preservation in situ is the best thing. So archaeological remains are preserved in the ground because they've reached an equilibrium with the environment around them. And so really the best place to leave them is in the ground, unless there's a development or some other reason that you need to excavate them. But that's actually no longer the case, particularly in places where the environment is changing radically. So if we think about permafrost or waterlogged conditions in bogs, which are drying out, permafrost is melting. So we really need to re-examine some of our, sort of dearly held beliefs. But in order to understand what's happening, we first need the research and data collection. And we need to be at the table when climate change policy is discussed. So it's really important that, when climate change adaptation or mitigation policy is made, that it considers heritage. But at the same time, I think it's important that heritage isn't seen as obstructive to society's attempts to both mitigate and adapt to climate change, because it is a reality, and we also need to be on board that train that's about addressing it. So we need to be prepared to compromise as well. But we can't do that unless we're at the table. So finally, transition and transformation. So we've talked about the potential impacts, what is climate change? What might its impacts be on heritage, and how might we start to address that in terms of management? But what I wanted to, that sees heritage very much as a victim of climate change. And what I really want to do now is turn it around and say, well, okay, that's what climate change means for heritage, but what could heritage mean for climate change? How can heritage actually contribute to society's effort to adapt and mitigate to what is, probably the defining challenge of this century anyway, if not the last. So if we go back to the Paris Agreement and we go back to Article 7, it states, unsurprisingly, that adaptation actions should be based on and guided by the best available science. But it goes on to say, and, as appropriate, traditional knowledge, knowledge of Indigenous peoples, and local knowledge systems. So that's heritage. That's where we can make a contribution, and that's acknowledged within the Paris Agreement. So that's actually quite a powerful statement, and it's important that I think that the heritage community recognize that and kind of step up to that challenge. So how can we offer traditional knowledge, local knowledge, to help society adapt to climate change? So there's different ways that we as heritage professionals and people interested in heritage can engage. So the first is to act, and we can all do this as individuals, but we also need to do this within our professional lives to reduce emissions. So, if you're in a heritage agency, a museum, or just you're an individual, it's really important to create that cultural shift that we start questioning energy use and reduction of emissions, and trying to work in a more sustainable way. Then enable. So as we've seen with the COVID pandemic, we don't live in a society that has full equality. And like COVID, climate change will affect some parts of society much worse than others. And so it's very important that anything that we do to address climate change is done with social justice and equality in mind, so that we narrow that inequality gap rather than widening it further. And lastly, influence. And this is really where I think heritage has a lot of power, because we tell stories and we're educators and we interpret the past for people in the present. And so there's a lot of potential there to engage people with climate issues, and also to help to create kind of social cohesion, which is very important when we're facing times of radical change. And of course, this is already being done. The museum sector, for example, is already engaging with reduction in emissions, and there's a lot of legislation that encourages this. Local authorities will also have carbon targets, and many funding bodies will require this as part of applications to get funding for projects. So thinking then of what we could call the co-benefits of heritage, so that the benefits that it can bring to the rest of society in terms of climate change. One of the things, of course, is that cultural resources are primary sources of data. So we can find out a lot about what happened in the past when there was climate change or other environmental upheaval. How did people react? How did they cope? Did they cope? I mean, the example of Rapa Nui is brought up a lot. How basically they cut down all their trees, and that is probably the reason that civilization ended. So we can learn from the past. We can also illustrate sustainable and traditional ways of living, within your environment. And as I mentioned already, cultural heritage has a lot of significance for local and national communities. People are very, they're very fond of their local heritage sites. They identify with it. It gives them a sense of place. And so you can use this as a vehicle for highlighting climate change issues, but also to contribute to kind of social cohesion and recovery. And Marcy Rockman has this concept that she says, you know, every place has a climate story. So even if you don't think you have a climate story, maybe look at it a bit closer and see you might. And so here's an example of some houses in Wexford in Ireland, where I'm from, and they've got slate on the upper 2 stories. You know, they're facing the sea. So this is a really great use of a local material to help to weatherproof just the side of the house that's facing the sea. This example, I think, is really nice. It's Starcross in Devon. So the church bells from this church were restored thanks to a grant from the Environment Agency. And in return for that, the bells are going to be used to peel out an SOS flood warning. And this is a village that has a long history of coastal flooding. So I think that's a really nice example of, you know, heritage people with, you know, heritage and other sectors of society coming together to do some good for a community. It benefits everybody. And I think it's just a really nice example of what I was talking about co-benefits of heritage. So really, I suppose I just wanted to end with that idea that, you know, yes, heritage will be impacted by climate change, and yes, we need to start thinking about managing the risk, but we can also and should also be thinking about heritage as part of the solution to climate change. And, you know, resilience theory does in any case suggest that we learn, and I suppose it's pretty logical, we learn how to manage change in the present if we can understand the past. And just to say, if you are interested in this sort of promotion of heritage as a resource for other sectors, to have a look at the work of the Climate Heritage Network, because they do quite a lot. They're quite active in this sphere as well. And they're on Twitter at Climate Heritage. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for listening. Please contact me if you'd like to. And thank you to the organisers and funders for this opportunity to talk. And I will stop sharing, and then we can have some questions.
Thanks, Cathy. That was really fascinating, especially being able to talk about how heritage can be a resource to help climate change, not just how we can work to stop it affecting us so heavily. I think Catherine Owen put down that Oxford City Council also has a heat tool as well, and a link to that, which is really helpful. If anyone has any questions, either type them in the chat or raise your hand, and you can speak and ask that if that's easier than typing. I think I'll just kick off with a question. So for individuals working in companies, what's the kind of best way for them to sort of start using their heritage as a resource? Is it better from a bottom-up or a top-down approach?
I think bottom-up has a lot of potential, because it is very much, you know, whatever you're going to do, whether it's adaptation, you know, to sort of ameliorate the impacts, increase resilience, or whether it's mitigation, you're trying to do something to reduce energy usage or emissions. It all has to be done on a local level. So yeah, I think we need the sort of top-down policies and champions and leadership and guidance, but for things to happen, you actually need people on the ground in local communities and, you know, on sites to start doing stuff. And a lot of stuff is happening out there. So you know, I was just trying to give an overview today, but probably a lot of people that are here are already doing really great projects. So yeah, we just need lots more.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I don't know if anyone has any questions in the chat at all. Yeah, so I think how are the sort of other sectors reacting to the to heritage? There are quite a lot of links between them there, or do people sort of it's more about how the policy is written rather than interlinking?
Yeah, well, when we did the adaptation policy for the Irish government, we had to look at the sectoral adaptation plans from all the other sectors and identify, possible synergies and also possible conflicts. And that was really important because the plans all come together to form the National Adaptation Plan, and there's a lot of potential for issues to arise. So, for example, the transport plan, they were talking about the need to rebuild bridges, for example, maybe, and so we had to say, well, a lot of those bridges are historic bridges, so we'd like to be involved, please, and some really positive things came out of that as well. So with forestry, for example, they actually flagged the fact that they have some funding for people to look at, because one of the things with increased winds and storms is that you'll get more tree fall, and they were aware that there's quite a lot of archaeology on the land that they own, and so they said that yes, we have funding, and we would love to engage with the heritage sector for them to come and do surveys so that we know where things are and where we can focus our attention. So yeah, I think it's quite exciting in many ways to see those, again, with agriculture, it was the same kind of thing. If people aren't aware of the issues, there could be conflicts, but once they become aware, they're generally pretty open to trying to find compromises. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting with everyone sort of working together and seeing each other's sectors and seeing how we can all adapt sort of in a multifunctional way rather than just keeping to our lanes. I also really like the examples you did of the church bells being used sort of multifunctional, not just as a heritage, but as a kind of a sort of a modern function. Do you have any more sort of examples of sort of really clever, innovative solutions like that, or any places where people can kind of where these are kind of published or shouted about a bit more?
Yeah, off the top of my head, there's quite. I would say there's quite a few people who are working on kind of traditional, maybe not. So I'm trying to think. I know somebody in Thailand, for example, who's an architecture professor who's working on traditional Thai buildings, which would have been built to allow flooding. So they're actually built of wood, and they're built on stilts. And so she, for example, is trying to promote that as an architectural form, and moving away from the kind of more modern concrete buildings on the ground. But that, again, that's, I suppose, more theoretical. The Star-Cross is just a great, neat little example. There was something in Holland I saw actually about flooding as well, and they have a lot of cellars in a lot of cities, I guess, but this was a city in Holland they were talking about, and people for a long time forgot their purpose of these cellars, and actually they were designed to take floodwaters. So now people are starting to move all their crap out of the cellar and use it as a reservoir for the floodwater when it comes. So I guess it's also about maybe regaining some of the knowledge that we've lost. Historic Environment Scotland had something as well about some features on buildings which people thought were decorative, but with increasing rain, they now realise that those were actually ways of protecting the building from rain ingress. So there's lots of little things out there, and I think, I'm sure people have them as well themselves, in their local area or in the buildings that they know. So yeah, it's great. It's quite powerful, I think, when you get those little things Yeah, and I would say, just to your earlier comment as well about working with other sectors, heritage is quite a small, poorly funded sector, so it is really important. Again, with Starcross, you saw that they got funding from the Environment Agency to conserve their bells, which wouldn't necessarily be the first place you think of going to, but it just shows that there's potential for really interesting partnerships out there as well, which can benefit heritage.
Yeah, and like you were saying, recovering that sort of cultural memory that we've forgotten through sort of traditional skills, and seeing how boat heritage used to kind of combat these issues that now becoming issues again. Yeah, and I think that was a really good way to sum everything up. How we can be useful, as well as how we can stop climate change impacting us.
Yeah.
Yeah, if no one has any more questions, or Cathy, if you have any sort of extra comments you'd like to say, then I think we'll finish up there. So thank you so much for joining. It was really, really informative. There are links in the chat that we've linked out to, so do follow those, and feel free to email me any questions that you have, and I'll forward them on to Cathy afterwards. Thanks for joining.
Thanks a lot, Pip. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Bye.